December 1944. A Third Army Supply Depot near Arlon, Belgium. The mercury clings to 15 degrees below zero, a punishing, biting cold that turns breath into ice crystals before it drifts away. Inside a sprawling, unheated tent, black engineer soldiers wrap their hands in filthy rags, their skin turning an ominous, dead white. They have been here for 6 weeks. They have built the roads that keep the army moving. They have received not a single overcoat, not a single pair of gloves, not one pair of thermal boots. 20 miles away, a white headquarters company sits in a heated warehouse surrounded by 400 crates of brand new winter gear. This is the moment the logistics of war turned into a quiet, frozen sentence of death. General George Patton is on his way to see why. This is the story of what happened when black engineers lost fingers to frostbite while 400 coats sat in a warehouse. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they had done. First, Lieutenant Rosa Watkins, 25, hailed from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where she had grown up in the shadow of the industrial shipyards. She had enlisted to prove that the promise of service was not limited by the color of one's skin. Having watched her own brother return from the North African campaign with a shattered leg and no fanfare. As the supply liaison for her engineer battalion, she had spent the last 2 years navigating a military bureaucracy that treated her unit's needs as an afterthought. She had filed the initial request for winter clothing 6 weeks before the bitter cold descended, following up with 4 separate appeals to the depot's office, only to be met with the same cold, dismissive promises of a next shipment that never arrived. She stood on the edge of the camp now, watching her men work with bare hands on frozen metal, knowing their physical suffering was a direct result of that ignored paperwork. Major Curtis Blevins, 39, served as the supply depot distribution officer and had arrived in the European theater from Omaha, Nebraska. He held a firm, deeply ingrained belief that the war effort had a natural, hierarchical order, and he saw it as his professional duty to ensure that priority remained strictly defined by race. On his desk sat a heavy, organized stack of requisition forms. The ones belonging to black units were neatly clipped and stamped with a bold, crimson ink that read, "Pending, low priority." He took immense pride in his orderly, heated warehouse, often polishing his boots to a mirror shine while he sat inside, fully aware that 400 heavy overcoats were hanging in the climate-controlled racks just 10 feet behind his chair. He truly believed he was protecting the Army's efficiency by reserving the best gear for those he deemed most essential to the front line, viewing his own exclusionary system as a necessary, logical standard of operation. December 1944 was a month of brutal uncertainty across the European theater. The Allied advance had outrun its own supply lines, leaving thousands of men stretched thin across the freezing expanse of the Ardennes. The ground was locked hard by a relentless, record-breaking winter that turned the simple act of existing into a daily struggle for survival. Because the logistics chain was fractured, and under immense strain, local supply officers gained an unprecedented, often unchecked, power over who received life-saving equipment and who went without. This atmosphere of scarcity encouraged a culture where convenience and bias frequently dictated the flow of resources. Many officers in rear echelon positions, far from the immediate danger of the front, grew accustomed to hoarding surplus gear. They convinced themselves that their own comfort and the status of their specific units took precedence over the urgent needs of the men digging trenches in the mud. For far too long, this hoarding was ignored by higher commands, chalked up to the inevitable chaos of a continental invasion. In the shadow of these heated warehouses, the lives of those on the front lines became secondary to the internal bureaucracy of supply. The system was designed to function on merit and necessity, but it had instead devolved into a distorted reflection of prejudices that were supposed to have no place in a unified army. Behind the heavy, locked doors of these depots, the reality of the war was being decided by clerks and officers who had forgotten the smell of cordite and the biting sting of the snow. Now, the bitter wind howling through the Arlon depot was about to bring that reality directly to their door. Captain Miller, the battalion commander, stepped into the supply depot office, his coat still dusted with fresh snow. He walked straight to the desk where Major Blevins sat, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. Miller laid a stack of medical reports on the polished wood. They were the evacuation papers for the 14 men who had just been pulled from the road project. "Look at these, Blevins. 14 men, frostbitten. 3 will never use their fingers again. We need the winter gear now." Blevins did not look up. He took a slow sip of his coffee and adjusted the edge of a folder on his desk. "The allocation schedule is firm, Captain. Your engineers are not on the priority list for this shipment." Miller leaned forward, his voice tight. "These men are working in 15 below. They have been out there for 6 weeks, building the primary supply artery for the Third Army. They are freezing to death. I am aware of their status, Captain. I am also aware of the supply directives. My orders are to equip combat units first, then support companies. Collared units fall into a different classification of availability." "Classification?" "There are 400 overcoats in that warehouse behind you. I can hear the men outside coughing. They are literally losing pieces of themselves in the ice. They will be served when the schedule allows. I have a system for a reason, Miller. It keeps the supply chain orderly. We cannot have officers running in here demanding special favors because of a little cold weather. This is not a favor. This is basic equipment. It is a matter of life and death. If you do not authorize the release of these coats, I will take this to the divisional command." Major Blevins stood up then, his face reddening. He leaned over the desk, his voice dropping into a cold, hard register. "You will do nothing of the sort. You are a support officer, and you will wait your turn like every other unit in that category. The chain of command does not bend for the convenience of your men. They are engineers, Captain, not infantry. They serve their purpose. You will leave these reports here and return to your post, or I will have you written up for insubordination and interfering with depot operations." Miller grabbed the reports off the desk, his eyes locked on Blevins. "The men are dying, Major. They are following the priority list, Captain. Leave my office." Miller turned and walked out, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen dirt outside. He went straight to his jeep and drove to the communications tent. He radioed his superior, bypassed the local chain, and dictated a full report on the conditions at the depot and the refusal of the supply officer to release available winter gear. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the supply depot's main gate, the engine cutting out with a sharp metallic snap that echoed across the yard. 4 stars glistened on the front of his steel helmet, and the ivory handles of his revolvers caught the pale winter light. He climbed out slowly, his boots crunching in the frozen mud, and walked through the warehouse doors unannounced. The chatter in the room died instantly. Every man froze in place, eyes locked on the general, as he moved with a measured, predatory grace toward the front desk. Patton stopped a few feet from Blevins, his expression unreadable and cold. He looked at the stack of forms on the desk, then at the major. "Major, how many men have you sent to the hospital this week for frostbite?" 14, sir. "And how many overcoats are currently sitting in this heated facility?" 400, General. "Why are the coats here instead of on those men?" Blevins stammered for a moment, his eyes darting to the floor. "Sir, the priority system." Patton stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "Explain your priority system to me, Major. You stated that combat units come first, then support, and that those men are labeled low priority because of their race. You have a heated building and 400 coats, while men are losing fingers in the cold. You think this war is won by your paperwork, but you are wrong. Wars are won by the men who move the earth and clear the roads so the tanks can advance. Those engineers are my men, and they are building my roads. Your system did not preserve efficiency. It only preserved your own arrogance at the cost of their blood. You have played God with a ledger, and you have failed." Patton pulled his gloves off, his hands steady. "You have 2 choices. You will load every one of these 400 coats onto trucks and personally deliver them to that engineer battalion within the next 2 hours. You will ensure each man is fitted. and you will apologize to their commander, or you will strip off your rank and your coat right now, and you will stand outside in the snow for the next 24 hours to see exactly what your priority system feels like. Decide now. Blevins stared at him, his face pale, before he nodded silently and turned toward the warehouse racks. The order was absolute. Blevins scrambled to comply, his face drained of color as he signaled the warehouse crew. Men moved in a frantic line, hauling heavy, dark green overcoats from the climate-controlled racks and tossing them into the back of a waiting truck. The scent of fresh canvas and mothballs filled the biting, frigid air as the pile grew higher. Other officers stood by, watching in stony silence. They saw the reality of the depot's hidden storehouses laid bare for the first time. Blevins himself had to grab a stack, his polished boots slipping on the frozen yard as he hauled the gear toward the waiting transport. Patton stood by his jeep, hands behind his back, watching the work proceed with cold, calculated intent. He did not look at Blevins. He watched the coats, seeing them not as fabric, but as the difference between a soldier's survival and a disabled life. When the trucks were finally loaded, they pulled away, heading straight for the exposed engineer battalion. Patton waited until the last vehicle cleared the gate before he turned and stepped into his jeep, leaving the depot behind without another word. The message was clear, burned into the memory of every man who stood there. No man in his army would be treated as an expendable asset while the resources to save him sat behind a locked door. First Lieutenant Rosa Watkins returned to Philadelphia after the war, carrying the weight of the men she had watched suffer in the Ardennes. She spent the rest of her years working in the municipal records office, ensuring that the contributions of black service members were never scrubbed from the history books. She passed away in 1994, still known to her neighbors as a woman who refused to let silence stand in the face of injustice. Major Curtis Blevins never recovered his standing within the Army. After his reassignment to the unheated field station, he served out the remainder of the war in obscurity, bitter and diminished. Following his discharge in 1946, he retreated to a quiet life in rural Nebraska, working as a clerk in a small insurance firm. He rarely spoke of his time in Belgium, and when he did, he always left out the part about the 400 coats. He died in 1972, remembered by few as anything more than a man who had once held a minor position of authority. General Patton kept the report regarding the supply depot in his private files for the duration of his command. He never issued a formal public reprimand for the incident, preferring to let the immediate field-level correction serve as the only lesson needed. In a letter written to his wife weeks later, he mentioned the depot, noting only that some officers needed to learn that their rank was not a shield from the reality of the front line. Some historians have argued that Patton's focus on immediate tactical readiness often led him to bypass established administrative protocols, creating friction with the broader Allied supply command. Others have argued that his interventions were necessary corrections to a logistics system that was failing the men in the field due to systemic neglect and prejudice. What is certain is that the directive he issued following this incident, effectively mandating the distribution of winter gear based on the severity of a unit's position rather than their designation, became a template for corrective action in the Third Army. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply filed a report and let the supply chain proceed as it was? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they'd done, make sure to subscribe.